Yee! Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Tiffany and I'm the owner of Tiffany Gordon Cosplay LLC, which is a company that focuses on costume and prop fabrication as well as education. And welcome! I'd love to have you as part of our cosplay community here, so subscribe to the channel as well as don't forget to like this video. On today's cosplay tutorial, I'm going to be going over how I made the tail for my Lilith cosplay. This thing! So let's begin! And here's a list of everything that I used for making my tail, and I'll have links to all of this in the description. And as a reminder, there's multiple ways that you could probably make this tail. This is just the way that I made it. And I say this because this tail is mostly 3D printed, and you can find my 3D CAD file, which is available on my website, TiffanyGordonCosplay.com, and I'll have a link in the description for it. And a little bit of how I made this CAD file. I basically started with 2D line art of each of the 4 pieces that I made for the tail. I made basic block shapes in Rhino 6, which is a 3D modeling program that I use. I then imported each of these 4 pieces individually into a 3D sculpting program called Nomen Sculpt, which I then used my tablet and sculpted each piece to give me my final results. And then I resin printed each of the parts. And for the middle piece, I did print it 8 times. So just be aware that you're gonna have a lot of pieces to this tail, and it's gonna add up with weight, which is why each of the pieces I ended up printing them so they were hollow on the inside with a 2mm wall thickness, but I would recommend for going to a 3 or 4mm wall thickness, as I did end up cracking one of the pieces because I accidentally sat on the tail, just for advice for you. And if you don't feel like resin printing, you can always use a normal printer and print it in either ABS or PLA. This will be a lot lighter, but you will have a lot more cleanup on each of the pieces. And here are the 4 main parts. I will note that for the bottom tail piece in my CAD file, it is one solid piece, and because of my size of my printer, I did have to slice it into 3 pieces to print on my bed, so you may have to adjust and slice it in certain spots to fit on your printer bed. And the smallest piece in the middle top is the part that I ended up printing 8 pieces of. Next, we're going to be curing all of the resin pieces, and for this, I'm going to be using my UV flashlight, putting it onto the entire surface of the piece. A reminder, you will need to be wearing safety protection, gloves because you don't want to touch your uncured resin, long sleeves, as well as your UV protection eyeglasses, as this is really bad for you. And as I said before, my bottom part of the tail, I had to split into 3 pieces so it would fit on my printer bed. So now we have to attach the pieces together. So first, what you're going to want to do is get some super glue, and you're going to apply it onto one surface, and then you're going to attach the 2 pieces together. This will give you a temporary bond for your pieces to hold together. And now we're going to resin weld the pieces together. And for this, we're actually going to be using the resin that we used for printing the pieces. And I just pour a tiny bit into a little disposable cup, and with a ceramic tool that has a pointed end, just put a little bit on the tip and then slightly rubbed it across the seam of the pieces. And then you'll want to get your UV light, and you're going to just slightly put it over that piece. The object of this is to be basically filling in that seam with your resin. So you do want it to go in between the 2 pieces and not just sit on top, as when you clean up, you still want the 2 joints to be together and to hit flush rather than having a bump over the seam. Then just repeat this a few times. You'll want to make sure that it's not just 1 layer thick. I typically will do 3 to 4, and if there's any deep gaps, you'll want to fill that part up. But you don't want to fill it with just liquid. You want to do it in slow layers, as your UV light is only going to cure that top layer. So you'll want to build up slowly with your layers. Then it was time for cleanup. And for this, I ended up going to my sanding bench, and with a Dremel and my sanding buffs, I ended up cleaning up all of the surface, trying to get rid of where any of the sprue trees were, as well as cleaning up my seams. And for this, I started off with a rough grit of 150, and then afterwards went back with 400. And I will note, this process will leave a slight dust onto the entire surface, so you will want to wipe this away with water and a paper towel, and make sure your surface is really clean after doing this before you go to paint. Now for painting the tail. And here are all of the tools and materials that I used for painting the tail. Reminder, you don't have to airbrush paint it. You can always paint it by hand using acrylic paint. And this step isn't quite necessary, but I like all of my materials to look the same, whether it is foam or 3D printed pieces, so resins or any PLA stuff. So for this, I want it all to have the same base layer. And I ended up using 3 heavy coats of Plastidip, which is a rubber spray paint, onto all of the surfaces. Reminder, you will need to wait at least 1 hour in between each coat, as well as an additional 24 hours after your last coat is dry before you start painting. And do be aware, if you are spraying the Plastidip onto a 3D printed surface, such as resin, it may peel off. This is why you need to make sure all of these surfaces are extremely clean and has no fingerprints or oils on the surface, as well as if this is in a spot that's going to rub constantly on the floor, it may end up rubbing your paint and rubbing the Plastidip off. So do be aware if you want to do this as a primer versus just painting your piece. Then for the paint that we're going to be using, it was all provided by Createx Colors, as well as our airbrush gun and compressor were both provided by Iwata Airbrush. So thank you to them. And we're going to start off with a base coat onto all of the pieces with Wicked Jet Black. Once that's dry, you're then going to want to apply onto all of the surfaces Gold Chrome. And then for shading, we're gonna be going back to Jet Black, and we're gonna spray it in small amounts, putting it onto the surface, and while the paint is still wet, you're gonna grab a paper towel and wipe it away. This will leave all of the wet paint in the crevices and make you have these really natural shadows, as well as make all of these pieces look more antique and less fresh gold. And to me, all of these pieces look like metal. And if you don't know, I have a metalsmithing background, and I used to be a jewelry designer, and we used to do these blue patinas onto copper and on brass, and I wanted to mimic this technique for all of my Lilith costume. And for this, I ended up doing a technique where I mixed the colors Fluorescent Aqua and Candy Tealicious, as well as adding a tiny bit of water and a lot of salt. And you want this to be very thick and lots of extra salt. And you're gonna grab just a trash paintbrush, a disposable one, and you'll apply this into the deep crevices around all of the piece. Once it dries, it's actually going to look slightly more white, and the salt is going to mineralize on the surface, looking like a naturally occurring patina onto your piece. Now, I will note that the salt is going to come off, so you will want to grab another paintbrush that is dry and just go ahead and scratch the surface of the salt to knock off the extra pieces. You want some of it to stay, and that's why you should apply this really thick, but you don't want the loose stuff. So the more paint to salt mixture, the more it's going to hold together as glue, where if you have too much salt, then it's more likely to come off. And I wanted to go back and add a little bit more of a deeper blue in some areas, so I just went straight up with Candy Tealicious, just applying in a certain spots, but it's not a necessary step. The last and most important step for doing this process is to seal it. And we're going to be using Createx Colors UVLS Clear, specifically their satin, because I want the surface to look like metal and have a more satin shine to the pieces. And we're going to apply it to everything, and this is going to help hold the rest of that salt onto your surface. Now for assembling the tail. And here's the rest of the supplies that you will need for assembling the tail, and I'll have links to all of this in the description. Now, each of these CAD pieces do have an already built-in tube on the inside of the pieces, as well as for the bottom part of the tail, it has a tube that goes to kind of a ball on the inside that you won't be able to see. And this is so that way you can put your wire in between, so that way it has something to hold onto as well as you can glue to. And the wire we're going to be using is specifically an electrical wire, so it has a metal wire through it, but then has a rubber cord outing, so that way it holds better. And the idea of this is I want the tail to still move, but not be too movable, and I want it to be extra strong, so I didn't want to use a string as that would rip and other materials. So I got the end of my wire, and then I bent it in half so it was a little bit thicker, and then I got my hot glue and hot glue gun, applied it to the ends inside of the bottom tail piece and then inserted the wire and held in place. And this would basically be my main connection. Then I just repeated the same process, fishing each of the tail pieces down, applying a little tack of hot glue to glue it to the resin piece, and then I filled up the bottom section to hold in place. I will note that I didn't have each piece touch as I wanted the pieces to fully move, so do be aware that they will lock and hold in place and not move, but you want them to be slightly separated so they will move like a tail. Then just repeat this process for all of the pieces. Now I will note that the hot glue did hold pretty well for a full day of wearing this Lilith costume at BlizzCon, but there were some parts where it moved so much from being dragged on the floor. Even when I had it hung up so it wouldn't drag, some of it kind of came off of the wire, the hot glue, so you may want to add a little bit of super glue or epoxy to bond it to the wire a little bit more, but I don't know if it's completely necessary. And for the final top part of adding all the tails, I ended up making a loop and then wrapping it in a coil and hot gluing that. This would make it so when I have my strap, I could go in and out of it and it wasn't permanently attached. So if you haven't seen the design of Lilith and her tail, it is actually supposed to drag on the ground. But when you put that into reality, that over time, rubbing on concrete and on con floors and other areas is going to slowly come apart. So what I wanted to do was add a backing to the main bottom tail part. And this was some leftover laminate floor kind of thing that I had for my rabbit's cage. And I ended up just tracing the piece, cutting with scissors, and then using contact cement glue to glue it to the back. And this worked pretty well. And it's something that I'm not concerned with. If it gets ruined, I can just replace it real easily. So I would recommend doing something like that, or getting some of the no-slip rubber grip to put on there. So that way it has something that's going to not destroy your tail, and also to kind of help hold it a little bit farther away. As when I walked, mine tended to slide and kind of come closer to me because of the weight. And for the strap that I made, it ended up being 1-inch size double bias tape, and I just sewed it to itself. And then I added non-adhesive back Velcro, so that way I could easily take it on and off of my waist. Now I will note that I would recommend doing a little bit of a thicker strap, as it ended up pulling my waist a little bit much, and I did end up having to add more Velcro and have it actually attached to the skirt to kind of hold it, just because the tail weighed a tiny bit. But that's my tad bit of advice for you. And for the tail, I ended up adding a strap with Velcro that'll go around my waist, as well as at the bottom part that's closest to the tail, I added 2 pieces of Velcro that would actually attach to the skirt of the Lilith costume, just to kind of help so it doesn't slide back and forth. And because I'm wearing this at BlizzCon, and the tail, yeah, you can walk around with it dragging on the ground, but there's a lot of people everywhere, I wanted to make sure that I could kind of hold the tail up. So I did add just a basic leather strap that when I'm wearing this around my waist, I can get the tail and pull it up and have it just kind of hold up on the side. And I found this to work really well. And that, guys, is how I made the tail for my Lilith cosplay from Diablo. I hope you found this video helpful for making your very own one for Lilith, or maybe some other critter that has a tail. Ooh. And if so, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. So like this video and subscribe to the channel. A big thank you to all of my company sponsors here on YouTube, as well as all of my members, specifically those legendary members who financially help to support me so I can continue doing this as my full-time job and also provide more cosplay tutorials for you. And I will see you for our next one. Much love, guys.